All right, good morning, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started with an Intacct webinar today covering monitoring purchase orders, how to use Intacct to manage commitments and budget obligations. I am going to record the class, so when this recording is complete, I'll send it back out. So if there's a report you wanted to go back over that we're going through or some of the stuff, and you're more than welcome to watch it as much as you want or share it with other coworkers. And then the slide presentation I have, I'll send that out too, which will have like kind of the written step-by-step of the stuff I'm gonna go through. So today we're gonna look at encumbrances or commitments. You might see that either language in Intacct. Briefly go over what creates them, what releases them. But this is gonna look more at after you have a purchase order. Not so much paying them, but what are you supposed to do with them when you see the balances on your report? How do you know what those are, what vendors they're for, or what documents they are? How can you look at a report every month to see what's being paid from your funds rather than just a financial report? So hopefully this will give everybody a good overview of doing that kind of stuff instead of just how do you create a PO. If you have questions as I go along, in the bottom right part of your screen, there is a box that says chat. So if you have a question, please add one there, and I'll get to it as we're going through. I have the chat box up on a different monitor, so I'll try to answer them as they come in. So very briefly, how do we create a commitment or an encumbrance? It's going to be either through a standard purchase requisition, a contract, indirect cost voucher requisitions, travel request, or a confirmed vendor amount when that gets approved to a travel request vendor payment. This is where all our encumbrances come from. So when we look at different reports, these are some of the things we'll take into consideration as we go forward. This is what releases the encumbrance: our vouchers, our justifications, travel reconciliations, canceling a trip if we didn't go on unapproved travel, or by closing a purchase order. So a lot of these documents become important when we get into a report down the line that's called purchasing transaction detail. It's important to know which workflows do what, so those report views become meaningful. And of course, the big question of, we look at a financial report, we have encumbrances, why are they still open? We might have purchase orders that are still pending, partially converted. If we've drafted a purchase order, or it says it's in progress. Vouchers, justifications, travel recs, or canceled trips are not fully approved yet. So maybe we have an encumbrance because we're waiting for a payment to be approved. Closed partial purchase orders might be dated for an incorrect period, which we see that from time to time when the fiscal year changes. Or the vouchers, justifications, travel recs, canceled trips are dated for an incorrect period, or we didn't convert something correctly. So some of the reports we'll look at today are going to help us hopefully get a better understanding of just those things and the easiest ways to find those. So we're going to get into Intacct and get to the home screen. First thing we always do is we run a financial report. Right, the most basic report we have available to us is one that tells us what we've spent, what our encumbrances are, and what our budget is. So I'm going to run a fiscal year report. And one of the things I want to point out on this one is who's using the fiscal year report. Typically, it's going to be people who are funded through the general fund, people funded through indirect costs, casino funded programs, any grants that are single year type of grants where the funding period matches the tribe's fiscal year. And if you operate from revenue funds, you'll be using the fiscal year report as well. We do have another set of reports called Life to Date, and those are more for the grants that operate multiple years, like 638 BIA, 638 IHS, multi-year grants, or single-year grants where the funding period doesn't coincide with the tribe's fiscal year. Head Start has a couple of grants that one operates September to August and the other one April to March. So a single year report like a fiscal year wouldn't catch all of the information they would need when they're looking at their financial reports. So you pretty much you fall into one of those two categories, or you might have funds that could be one or both. So the first part is which report are we going to use? The example I'm going through today is a general fund account, so we'll be only looking at the fiscal year grant or fiscal year financial reports. So let's go to the report center. And if you haven't had a chance to use this yet, or you've seen it and weren't sure what it does, at the top of the report center, there is a search bar that whatever word you type, it's going to use it as a keyword search, and it will shorten the list of reports you have access to matching what you've typed up here. Yeah, so I'm going to run a fiscal year report. So when I type fiscal, it's going to shorten up the list to only those that have the word fiscal in the name. And so we can see I've got them starred for to be added to favorites, but there's 6 different reports for a fiscal year. There's one that just shows expenses for one funding source. There's one that shows expenses for all your funding sources, and then it'll separate those funds so you can see each of those funds in one report rather than having to run multiple reports. One that just does revenue, and then the other 2 are the same types, but they do revenue and expenses together. So we've given a lot of options there for how we want to run a report. And we're running just a general fund one. So I'm going to use the fiscal year expenses. And I'm running it for FY20. So the as of date is going to be 9/30/20 because I want the fiscal year that ends on September 30th, 2020. We're not going to look at a current report today. We'd want to know our program, our checkbook, and we're running for one funding source. If I left the funding source blank, as any user can do, if there were multiple funds that were assigned to Koya and general account, it's going to combine all those funding sources into one report. If we're running a report that says it's called a one funding source view. So be careful with that if we're looking for good budget information, we're preparing a mod, that kind of stuff, because we may end up mixing together 2 different funding sources and not getting accurate information. So I'm going to put in the one funding source. Vendor I'm going to leave blank because we're looking for the report overall. And so now we'll go ahead and let the report run and probably take a minute for it to go. But the fiscal year reports are all designed to display fiscal year information. The as of date kind of controls the output. Whatever date we give, that's the date the report's trying to match. So if we need past or historical information, we can just go right to one of those and use a date from a previous fiscal year to get the report. So we get the result. And on this report we're looking, we have a $35 encumbrance. And if we're not sure where that's from, because a lot of us have this scenario, we look and we see these balances in the encumbrance column, what are we supposed to do? What vendor is it? Do we know if it's a purchase order or contract or any of that kind of stuff? That might not be very helpful. When we run the one funding source view reports, we get the added benefit of anything that's in blue, all of these numbers we can click on. So if I clicked on the $35, we can see a list of all the transactions that have transpired and resulted in a $35 balance. And depending on how much activity you have, this could be pretty difficult to discern where the $35 came from. And so we have 2 purchase orders that were created and maybe a dozen or so different commitment releases where these were likely payments that were converted from the purchase orders. So we know it could be one of two vendors based on what the report is showing. So it might not be helpful to us still. But it's a good starting point for us to know that for the fiscal year FY20, our telephone fax line has a $35 encumbrance. And so if we were the program director, we want to know that we've paid our purchase orders. We know that the accounting manual says purchase orders are supposed to be closed after 60 days. This should raise some flags for us that we're 6 months down the line and we still have an encumbrance sitting out there. So what would our next option be? We've clicked on the $35 and it might be harder to tell what we're doing with that. So let's look into this further. There's another report that we have called FY Encumbrances by Vendor. So everyone has access to this report. And similar to a financial report, when we go to run that, we can tell it what day. So we were wanting the report to come or to start with fiscal year 20 and end on 9/30 of 20. Every user should be putting in their program and checkbook. And you can specify a funding source or you can leave funding source blank too. This one works differently than the fiscal year report, where if we left the funding source blank, any funding source that is assigned to Koya and general account would show up on this report that had transactions. So if we're a program that has multiple checkbooks, if we're ambulance services, you could run your report using your program and choosing the checkbook that says all checkbooks. You run that and you would get all the funding source results in this report to display at one time. We'll stick with Koya. We have our funding source, and now we can let this report run. Now this report will be, just a little bit different than the financial report. We're going to be able to quickly identify who the vendor is that the balance sits with. A lot easier to read than the financial report. A lot easier to read than that detailed general ledger report. And we had multiple vendors on that general ledger report, multiple transactions, and we're at that $35 balance again. And now we know specifically what vendor that is. It's Golden West Telecommunications has a $35 encumbrance balance. So if we were happy here, we just wanted to know our vendor, hey, we're good. We have that information. We can tell our assistant to go out and pay that bill. If it's something that's been sitting there for a while, then do we contact the vendor to say, where's the invoice for this transaction? What is our next step to do once we know this? But this is a good jumping off point to move to our purchase orders to look for this. Maybe we go to the purchase order list view to find out, was this thing paid in a different period of time? And we can also run a different report to go to more detailed information. So we have the financial report as an option to tell us just what our balances are sitting out there for our line items and our funds. We have the fiscal year vendor encumbrances report that'll at least tell us which vendors the encumbrances sit with. But none of those things still give us direct information about what transaction could that actually be. We need to know which purchase order this is. We need to find out if it's been paid. Maybe it's been dated for a wrong period of time, or it's just something that we've opened and no longer need to have that holding against our budget. So if you haven't run this report before, it's called Purchasing Transaction Detail. And notice all these reports are coming all from the same place, the report center. So we all have access to this report, Purchasing Transaction Detail. And it tells us the same information. Here's the reporting period for this report. It's a fiscal year report, current year to date. It defaults to today's date, just like a financial report. We're wanting information from 9/30 of 20. We want fiscal year 20 for this report. What is our checkbook we're searching? So again, you can choose a single checkbook or all if you're wanting more than one type of funding source to show up. What is our program? Or if you have access to multiple programs, you can choose all programs also as an option. So we've got general account, we've got Koya. We can choose a single funding source or leave it blank for all funding sources. Going to stay consistent with the one fund we're looking at. Item ID. What's the expense line item that we're wanting to look at specifically? Maybe we only want the phone line to show up, or just travel, or whatever it is. We can choose one of those. I'll leave it blank. The next two boxes is what's going to require a little more knowledge from the person running the report. So we should know what's creating the encumbrances, what lets the encumbrances go, and what are the documents that connects the purchase requisition to a voucher. It's a purchase order, right? So under type, we might be looking for purchase order. And we can choose from this list any of the purchasing transaction workflows that are out there. You can choose one, or you have to leave it blank for all of them to be picked. So we'll look at purchase order. And if anyone wants to add to the chat box, which of these states for the purchase order would tell us that the purchase order isn't closed? And here we can choose multiple types of states. Is there any point at which a purchase order is submitted? And the answer, of course, to that is no. Purchase orders aren't submitted or approved. That's the purchase requisition, and the purchase requisition gets converted to the purchase order. So we don't need to worry about any of the things that have action items about approvals. Can a purchase order be put into draft mode? Yes. It can be pending if we have never taken any action on the purchase order. Purchase order can be in progress if we've converted the purchase order into a voucher or a justification, and then we've drafted the voucher or justification. So it'd be a flag to us as we're looking at our reports, looking at a purchasing transaction detail, or we're in the purchase order workflow, we have the list of stuff in front of us. In progress is a flag to anyone that the work on that purchase order isn't done. If our purchase order is converted, should the encumbrance still be sitting out there? No. So we're not going to look for converted ones. But if it's a blanket purchase order, we might have a partially converted purchase order. And we don't use the other two options for converting by line. So we have the 4 states on a purchase order that tell us when or why a PO has an encumbrance balance sitting on our financial reports. We could choose a vendor if we wanted to. We ran that fiscal year vendors encumbrances by vendor report. So if we only wanted to look at the one vendor, there's the vendor information, and we could put that here. So if we wanted to just look at a particular one, we do that, or we leave it blank because we want anyone with a PO in these statuses to show up. So I'm just going to leave it blank. And now we can view this report. And so we end up coming up with no information. We have fiscal year 9/30/20, general account Koya. That balance fits none of these things. So if a purchase order isn't creating the encumbrance, does anyone listening know where the next option is that we'd want to look at on this report? So we know from here it's Golden West, so we probably don't have a contract open. So the answer would be our vouchers, right? Did something happen to a voucher and we need to know about that? So a voucher, we know it's not going to be drafted because we use that in progress. So a PO isn't in progress. The voucher certainly could be submitted. It might be partially approved, or it could be declined. So now let's rerun the report with a voucher instead of a purchase order. So we have a result. We know that in February of 2020, a voucher was submitted. It was declined, and it's had a budget hold in FY20 for 7 months, meaning that those funds weren't accessible to spend. But now we have that information. We can then start looking to see, did we pay Golden West for this invoice in another way, since we never completed this purchase? Do we need to contact Golden West to check our account? And now we can take the next steps that's needed to manage that encumbrance. And number one, either get this unpaid for item paid for, or if we find out it's paid in another way, then we need to take steps to get the encumbrance off our books. Even more important, obviously, in the current fiscal year, because stuff like this can be sitting out there and keeping us from being able to spend money that we're not being able to access if we're not following through on our balances and finding out which purchasing documents we can use, or which ones we should be looking for, and which ones should we be taking action on or instructing our staff to look into, and then we can make a decision what to do. So if we weren't sure what to do with this, we know this is converted from, and this report has a column converted from. We could research this purchase order. So let's copy this purchase order, go to our purchase order workflow, and we can find the PO. And if we want a subordinate to take care of this in the office, or we want to contact the vendor, we can use the print email option here on the side. We want to print it, or we can email it to Golden West happens to have an email address, so or we can change that to another coworker. It'll have who it's being sent from. I'm the default person in this, so if you ever do this, my name pops up. Make sure you change it to yours so it looks like it comes from you. And then we can click OK, and off that would go to the email address, and we can ask that question. Why is this purchase order not paid? Why is the voucher to this declined? What happened to this payment? Those types of questions. And then if we find out that, hey, this was in fact paid, or we no longer need it, we'd have to go to the decline voucher, delete that so we can close the rest of that balance. Does anyone have questions about the purchasing transaction detail report? If you do, go ahead and add them to the chat box on the bottom right. So those are our options for some reports. That purchasing transaction detail report is a report I like to use primarily to look up people's instances for stuff like this. When we're looking at encumbrances, or someone has a question about why there's a certain balance on their account. Great report. Another thing we can do for our current purchase orders is, while we're in the purchasing transaction purchase order view that we're at now, you can build your own view if you haven't done that before. So we can see certain information. So I happened to create one, that's where we landed on what I showed up, called the Open POs View for training. And when you build your own view, you can make it and show whatever information you want. So if we want to create our view, we all have this option next to the view that says Manage View. Is there a view that we like? So maybe we can save that view as something else and then make a couple of changes to it. Or if we're going to start an entirely new view, we'd want to go to Manage Views and create a new view. And when we get here, we get this little 5-step wizard that helps us make a view that we'd want to see. And so we get a list of all the columns in the report, or in the purchase order area. What stuff do we want to add? The document number is the PO number, or if we're at vouchers, that'd be the voucher number, that kind of thing. What state, or do we want the state to show? The vendor's name, the date. There's already some stuff that's picked. Maybe we don't want reference number, so we can uncheck that. We want to know where the purchase order came from, what was the purchase requisition, just in case we need to look at the purchase requisition. We have the total. Do we want to know the type? We're already at purchase orders, so type might just take up extra space on screen, so we won't include type. And we have vendor checked, and then vendor name checked. Vendor, that's going to be the vendor number, and the name, obviously just the name. And then payment status is checked by default. Purchase orders aren't paid, those go to a voucher first, and the voucher's paid, so the payment status isn't going to be important to us either. But you can see we probably have like maybe 50 different boxes we can choose from when building our report. So once we have the information we want, we can go to the next step. What order do we want this report to be displayed in? So in our columns, when we're looking at that list of stuff left to right, do we want document number first? So we'll go with document number first. Maybe we want the vendor and vendor name. And each of these lines, these little gray areas, you can just click and drag the box to order how you want the report to show on your screen. You can change the text so that your view will have whatever information you'd want to see. You know, whatever would be important to us of what we want it to be called. And the next step is a filter, which this might be the most difficult part for a person, unless you've worked in Excel some. But we can now tell the report more specifically on this purchase order view, what kind of information do we want to see? So like in that purchasing transaction detail, we want to know anytime a purchase order is pending or partially converted. So if we use equals, that lets us choose one state. But if I do includes, it's going to let us choose multiple things. We'd have to type it exactly as they are. So this report, I want to include anything where the state is pending or partially converted. What about the date of the purchase order? So I might want the date to be greater than or equal to October 1st, 2020. So we're going to look for anything in fiscal year 21. We're going to filter out the hundreds of other things that we've done in the 5 years we've had Intacct. Is there a cutoff point where we want this information for? We know that purchase orders really shouldn't be open for more than 60 days. So let's go back to date, and we want the date to be less than or equal to February 28th. So now what we're telling Intacct is in this view, show us only purchase orders that are pending and partially converted, and that fall in between the date of October 1st and February 28th. And that could be for any dates that you want, any different state you'd want, but this is the information we're gonna look for. You can have more filters if there's other things you wanted to show or wanted to filter by. And it doesn't even have to be include stuff that you're including in the column selections. It can be any of these things that we filter by. And so if we only wanted for specific vendors, that kind of thing. Or if we have multiple users in our program, we want to know just purchase orders that are created by a specific employee. We can find who the created user is and then use that person's username. But for now, we're going to look for POs between October and February. How do we want this information sorted? Do we want it sorted by PO number, by date, by the vendor name, by the amounts? Well, we're saying the dates are pretty important here. And so maybe we want to start with the earliest date and then building up to the latest date. So we'll put date on top and say ascending. And then if we want the vendor name to be the next thing, we can say we want it starting with date ascending, and we want the result to have the vendor names in alphabetical order starting with A. Or a number if it starts with a number. And now we go to the last part, which is to save this view. It has to have a unique name. So I'll call it that. Don't click deploy if you're going to build your own report. That would populate everybody's views with it. And I think there's like 10 of us in this room right now. If we all went and did that, every single person would suddenly have 10 new views to use, where some of them may not be important to the other person. So we'll do training PO view, save our work. When you come out to this thing, you're going to go to the first view that you were on before you started making one. So now we can click on the list view, find the one that we made, and now we have a list. Starting with the oldest purchase order that's pending or partially converted. We now have a list of the 385 POs for the tribe that are still open for FY21, where the purchase order is still having an effect on our encumbrances. Some of these we can see, like Cherry Todd, Golden West, La Creek, those could be blanket purchase orders, and the partially converted is a huge signal to us that those are probably blanket purchase orders. So that you might not want to include. You may only want pending. So we can now look through our list. So if any of you do that and build that in your office, this is something you could refer to now and see what are these things that are lingering out there that we need to make sure and take care of. We don't want a surprise letter in the mail from a vendor or a collections agency or something saying, hey, you haven't paid your Mission Ace hardware bill now for 6 months or however long it's been. So whatever program that would build this report and see this Harry Key Napa or the Mission Ace hardware POs that have been sitting open since October, if we're that program, we know we have to get into gear and do something with this. Are we going to close this purchase order? Are these things that we forgot to pay? Did they not send us an invoice? Did we pay through a different method? What is it we have to do? So now we can print and email these things and get them to our assistant or email it to someone from the vendor to ask a question. And then when the next month hits, we can come right back to this view, edit the view, and go back to our filters and say, we're going to expand that now to include March. So we can get all the stuff from March. Or because we know partially converted stuff could be blanket purchase orders. Maybe we only want pending activity going forward. And we save that, and now we're working with some more current information that will load. We went for 300 and some now to 449 by adding March. So a lot of options open to us to managing our POs. We can do that purchasing transaction detail report, find the actual list of all the stuff that's sitting out there open. Or we can also build one of these and more specifically look and be ready to work on these purchase orders. So we do have a question. If it's a deployed view, can anyone change the filter? Yes. So if we've deployed this view and this was something you've created that you really like, someone else came across it and changed something on you, you wouldn't want that to happen. So make sure you don't deploy the view. So if we were all in Intacct now, this training PO view and this open POs view training are things I've created but didn't deploy, so you guys wouldn't see those on the list. But you get to make it yours. And you can make them or exclude specific vendors when you're doing the filter. So we have all this information, and we see and. So the state is pending, and the date is greater or equal to October 1st, and the date has to be less than or equal to March 31st. And if we knew a certain vendor, we're doing this and we don't want to include a certain vendor, or it's only a certain vendor we're looking for. We do a lot of business with IT or someone else like that. We can build one just for them and filter out all the other stuff. I don't remember how Allstop's name is, but know it's all one word. So let's just say it has to be pending October through March, and the vendor has to have the name All Stop in it. So you could build that and just manage your All Stop stuff. Or put in multiple, includes, and then put in the exact name of the vendor. So All Stop is All Stop Inc. And then we could do the same thing with our payments. How do we know a voucher's been paid or a purchase order has been paid? Right. It might be hard to see here while looking at this list. From the columns, we can select that column here that says payment status. And so maybe we only wanted converted purchase orders, stuff we know has been converted to a voucher. Adding the payment status in a purchase order custom view, these things are never getting paid, right? They're being converted to a different document, so it's something else that's paid. So you could go and build the same thing at voucher, or you can go to view transactions. So I created one yesterday getting ready for this called paid POs and justifications. And so I went and picked the document number, the state, the date, the total, where it was converted from, and then the payment status. And the filters I used were, I wanted the document type to include a voucher or justification workflow. The converted from, I wanted it to contain the word order, so I knew it come from a purchase order. The date, anything greater than May 1st, just wanted a short list of information. And where the payment status, it doesn't equal open, meaning the payment, it's been paid. And so this report gives us a list of all the payments we've made. As a voucher or justification, where it originated as a purchase order. And if you create a view like this for your own program, you can then see, okay, these are the list of purchase orders we've paid for the month of May, since this view only includes the month of May. And then you can fix that date like we did with the purchase order view to be a certain period of time. Do we want the date between March 1st and March 31st? Or whatever period of time you want, so you can start to be prepared to answer those questions of what documents are we paying? So this view doesn't have the purchase order in it. So if I go to these paid POs, oh, there we are. It even tells us the PO. So now we can tell the program director if they're asking us, or if as the director we're keeping up with whatever's happening with our program, we would know for the month of May, this is what we've paid so far. Any questions about the purchase custom views? If you try to make one and you want to design one for yourself, if you're running into issues, send me an email or a screenshot or something, and I'll help you figure that out. Because it can be frustrating, particularly at the filters part. If you haven't done it before, it takes a little bit getting used to. And one of the nice things is, obviously at the purchasing stuff, we can't use checkbook as one of the things to include in this view. So if we weren't sure, well, are these payments for my general funds or my casino funds or my IHS money? There's a little thing up here that says top level. You can choose the checkbook you want to see. So if I wasn't sure what was what, I could come here and choose checkbook 3. Now that list of payments went down greatly for the month of May to only show what's happened out of the general fund for vouchers through POs. And so if you're on the ambulance services, you can kind of get a quicker look at what's going on for your checkbooks. We can't convert them. We can't take action on stuff when we're in this view that says whatever checkbook we're in, but it cuts out all the other things. So now I've cut out a ton of information to only have checkbook 3 vouchers or justifications that have been paid in the month of May. And I cut that list down to 11. And so I only have the vendor's number here. I didn't include the name in this report. But if you have the name here, now you know pretty quickly, hey, who do we take care of this month? Or for running this for the month of April, here's all the bills we paid in April. Here's all the POs that we've taken care of. And then their voucher numbers that go with it. And at the top of the screen, when you pick a checkbook up here, it adds a new tab. So you can see this one says general, this one says disbursement. So just to get back to the regular top level view, all you got to do is click this thing up here. Close your tabs once you're done with looking at that stuff. And get back into the top level to take whatever action has to be done. If we're looking for purchase orders that we need to pay or close or that kind of thing. And we have a few more minutes here. The last thing I wanted to talk about was our check register. Under accounts payable, there's registers and check register. If you've ever used them, we'll use the current month as of March 31st. So just basically we're looking for the month of March. So maybe we're going to use Golden West specifically. You can put any range of vendors you want or leave it blank for all. And so I want to know all the checks written to Golden West from the general account for all programs. But if we notice, the check register doesn't let us pick a funding source. So when we view this report, we might not get a lot of information that's useful to us other than knowing here's the check numbers, or in this case ACH numbers, that paid Golden West, and whether or not they cleared the bank. So we have a date there so we know they cleared. Good information for us to use. Supports that voucher look that we were looking at a few minutes ago. Run this every single month for your monthly checks to see who we've been paying. But I've also created a different check register report than the one Intacct offers. So if we go back to our report center and start typing check register, we get one called check register more detail. So we can choose a period of time that we want to see. So let's do the current month again for March. For checkbook 3, all programs. For Golden West. And when we view that report, nothing there. So let's try the other number for Golden West. Instead of like kind of blank report that we get the ACH numbers in and the date it cleared, now we get our funding sources. So when you run your check register and see who you paid for the month, use this check register more detail report that you'll find in the report center And you could either specify a single funding source, that funding source column's here, or leave it blank and get them for all your funds that you have access to. And you would know for the month, here's my check register, here's exactly who paid who. So a little bit better view than what Intacct gave us on their check register. All right, we just have a couple minutes left. That's all the information I was going to go through. So if anyone has questions, please ask them now. Hopefully you found this helpful, especially the purchasing custom views. You can really take advantage of that for managing the purchase orders, for getting quicker looks at stuff. If a typical user, if we go to purchase order, we land at the all thing unless we've been using a custom view. So for those of us in finance, when we get there, our list is 51,000 strong and building every single day. That's not good enough for us because we need to find information a lot more quickly. So take advantage of those views, take advantage of the check register, more detail. Okay, everybody, thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.